Hello. The Divine Code reading for April 3rd, pages 601 and 602. We are in the chapter Laws of Returning Stolen Objects and Restitution for Theft. Topic number 18. When a thief steals an item and sells it to another person, the obligation of the thief or the person who buys it from the thief is to return the original item depends upon whether or not the owner despairs and at what point he despairs. So there's a concept of obligation both upon the thief and also a third person who purchases it or somehow obtains it from the thief. So now the third person now has obtained the item, and what is done under those circumstances? A. If the owner despaired of receiving the item before the sale, the buyer acquires it in the owner's despair, with the owner's despair, and this change of jurisdiction. And rest in Rambam, Laws of Robbery, Chapter 2, Laws of Theft, Chapter 5, and Shulchan Aruch, Choshen Mishpat, Chapters 353 and 356. So the question is, what is the status of the object? If someone stole an object, a garden gnome, and he sold it at the flea market, now a third person has it, does the third person actually own it? Does the person that bought it at a market actually own the object? Or is it still owned by the original owner? If the original owner had given up expecting to see his object back, the garden gnome disappeared in the middle of the night. He doesn't know where it's at. He said, after a day or two, he just gave up hope of locating it. And if that's the case, then the person who purchases it at a market has ownership of it. The thief then only needs to reimburse the owner for the value of the stolen object, for the stolen item. And so if the neighbor steals a garden gnome in the middle of the night, the owner despaired of seeing it again. He doesn't expect to see it again. He's given up looking for it. And now the thief has sold it. After the owner despaired, the thief sells it to another person, put it on eBay, sold it to another person, and the owner does not get the item back, but rather the thief is still responsible to reimburse him for the cost of the item. Even though the item exists somewhere, it's left the jurisdiction of the owner and gone to the new owner, the guy who purchased it. The rulings of this topic follow Torah and Rima Choshen Mishpat, chapter 353 and 356. The owner's despair combined with the change in jurisdiction make the item fully acquired by one who buys it from the thief, and he is entirely not obligated to compensate the victim. Therefore, it is clear that the victim can demand reimbursement for the entire item, the entire value of the item, and if it appreciates in value between the time of theft and the sale, the thief must pay for the value of at the time of the sale, as explained above in topic 16. So these are similar to the rules that if an item was if an item was broken or lost by the thief has jurisdiction over the item, even though he doesn't own it, but he has guardianship of the item. And if the item is lost or stolen while in the thief's guardianship, then he has to reimburse the owner for it. Similarly, if he sells it to someone, that's similar to having it lost or stolen. If the owner despaired, if the owner didn't despair, then it's a different topic. It'd be the next paragraph, I think. If the owner despaired of seeing it again, then the thief has, then the object has changed in such a way that the owner cannot get it back, and the thief has to reimburse him for it. Therefore, it is clear that the victim can demand reimbursement for the entire value of the item, and if it appreciates in value between the time of the theft and the sale, the thief must pay for the value of the item at the time of sale, as was explained above in topic 16. Their option is that the transfer in their opinion is that the transfer in jurisdiction over the item, for example, it was sold by the thief after the owner despairs, does bring acquisition to the item, since it is coming into the buyer's jurisdiction legally, being that there is no longer owned by the victim at all because of his despair. Now, if the thief still was holding on to the item, he just has he took the garden gnome and it's in his basement, and it's perfectly fine, even if the owner despaired of seeing it again. If it shows up, he's supposed to get it back, the item back, even if he had despaired. He still owns it. So if the owner despaired and it's sold, it's no longer being returned at that point. According to it's transferred ownership at that point. However, in the Rambam Laws of Robbery 5.3 holds that if the owner despairs of recovering an item that was robbed from him, and the second person is thereby able to buy the item from the thief, even if he knows that the item he is buying is stolen. This only means that he is able to keep the item, but he's still obligated to pay the value of the original owner. This is also the ruling in Shulchan Aruch Kosher Mishpat, chapters 353 and 356. This is because his view is that the buyer is merely committing a second act of theft and completely removing the item from the owner's jurisdiction, even if he is doing so unwittingly. So there's different opinions on this. One opinion is that the owner, that the first thief reimburses the owner. The second opinion is whoever has jurisdiction of the item, whoever has ownership, the new ownership of the item, is the one that has to reimburse the owner for it. So the person bought the garden gnome at the flea market. The garden gnome's worth $20. He bought it at the flea market for $10. And according to the according to the first opinion, the thief that sold the garden gnome at the flea market has to reimburse the owner the $20. The second opinion is that the person who has possession of the garden gnome, not only did he pay the thief $10 for it, but now he has to pay the owner the $20. It appears that this whole argument exists only where the owner is able to force the thief, is not able to force the thief to pay for theft. At which point it is disputable whether he can demand it from the buyer, or where the item appreciated in value after the theft, where there is more money involved that can be demanded from the buyer. Otherwise, there is no reason that he should not get it from the thief, and the buyer should not have to pay. So when it says it appears, okay, so trying to make sense of this between the different opinions. One idea is that what's being advanced by the divine code is that if the owner, if it comes out, what happens? He finds the eBay sale. He finds a record of the eBay sale, and he says, "Oh, but the guy took my garden gnome and he sold it to someone." Then he goes to the person, the thief. He finds out the thief, for whatever reason, can't pay it. He's retired now. He's in a nursing home. He can't pay for the garden gnome, and now he says, okay, he still wants reimbursement for the garden gnome. So he goes to the guy who bought it. The guy who bought it may or may not have a clue. Good chance he doesn't have a clue that it's stolen. And the guy just knocks on his door and demands payment for the garden gnome. And the question, then possibly the person who has it in his possession would need to pay for it, is what's being Rambam and Shulchan Aruch Kosher Mishpat both would say that the buyer does need to pay for it, and that's what's being suggested by the divine code, that if the thief cannot pay for it, then the buyer would have to pay for it. B. Oh, I'm sorry. Continuing in this footnote. So we're still in A. The reasoning seems that the obligation to return the item always remains with the original thief who originated the theft, and even where the buyer bought the item intentionally. Knowing that it was stolen, he was not the one who actually stole it. His only obligation comes from the positive command in Jewish law to return a stolen item, or because practically the item belongs to the owner, he can demand it back, or alternatively, because his continued use of possession of the item is theft. So these are three ways of understanding why the guy who bought it at the flea market or bought it on eBay or somewhere, why he might be obligated to pay for the object. And the first one is, well, the first one is because it's a stolen item, and the owner has every right to demand it back. Or no, the first reason is because there's an obligation to return items that don't belong to you. If the item doesn't belong to the person, the guy who bought it, it still belongs to the owner. Therefore, there's an obligation to give it back. And since he has an obligation to give it back, it still belongs to the first one is because there's an obligation to return stolen items. That's even upon a person who gets the stolen item through the marketplace. The second one is that because the owner still owns the item, he still has an ownership over the item, and therefore he can demand it back. He just take the item back. So he could say, well, give me back my garden gnome. So the same way he could say, he's like offering an option in the second the second one here is that he's offering the guy who bought it an option: give me back my garden gnome, or pay me the $20, which is what's the value of it is. And the third reason is that it's if the owner knows that it's stolen, then continuing to possess the item would be a continuation of the theft. And even if he didn't steal it the first time, the fact that now he's continuing to keep it, even though it's stolen, is puts him in as like an accessory to the theft. So that's the three reasons there. However, the main obligation to return the item is to fix up what he did originally, and this only applies to the thief itself. So the primary obligation is upon the thief. What's the obligation upon the person who purchased it? The third person is a lesser obligation. So obviously, you go to the thief first to get reimbursed for it. And see Rambam Laws of Theft, Chapter 5, and Laws of Robbery, Chapter 5, that the buyer is only transgressing for assisting the thief, but not as an act of the theft itself. So the primary obligation is upon the thief, but there's still a secondary obligation upon the person who purchased the item, even if he did innocently. B, if the owner did not despair. Okay, so the first option is the owner had despaired. He didn't expect to see the item back. And so what happens in that case? And the second case is the owner did not despair. So he's still looking for his garden gnome. He's putting signs up on the street side, on the street light, saying missing garden gnome. And he's looking everywhere for it. Okay. And deep inside his heart, he hopes to see his garden gnome again. Okay. Okay, the owner does not despair of the item and the item is still intact. The buyer does not acquire the object. It must be returned intact to the owner, and the buyer can demand the value of the item from the thief who stole it to him illegally. It appears that one who buys a stolen item from a thief is not considered a delinquent debtor, and although the owner can demand it back, this is only because the stolen item did not belong to the buyer and not because he is transgressing any prohibition of theft or delinquency. So there's no criminal aspect on the part of the buyer, on the part of the third person who bought it. In this case, if the person owns the item, goes to the person that bought the item at the flea market, demands it back, the buyer has to give back the item because it still belongs to the owner. In the case where he was expecting to see it back, he did not despair. He was expecting to see the item back. He found out where the item is. He goes, knocks on the door, and says he's taking back his garden gnome. And the buyer has to give it back. But the buyer is not responsible for any criminal activity, because such as theft, because he didn't steal it. He just bought it at the flea market. This is the law based on the written Torah. Okay, so what they're describing here is the straight up Torah law. And however, the sages enacted that the owner should not be able to remove the object to the buyer unless he, the thief, who reimburses the buyer, pays for its worth. So the straight up Torah law is that the owner of the item, the first person who owns the item legitimately, can go and demand his item back from the buyer. The sages, what happened was, the concern is that if people would not be willing to buy things at the marketplace. If a person goes to the marketplace and they want to buy something, they never know for sure if it was stolen. So unless there needed to be some kind of a community acceptance of possible law, that if something is bought legitimately at the market, it's not being bought out of a back alley in the guy's trunk of his car, where he says that things fell off a truck and they were ownerless. Because in that case, it's probably stolen. But if the guy's buying it at a regular marketplace where you expect everything to be, there needs to be a expectation that when a person buys something at the marketplace, they're going to be able to keep the item that they bought and not worry about someone showing up and demanding it back. So in order to allow commerce to occur, because if people had fear, they wouldn't buy anything, and commerce would grind to a halt, and the economy would be in trouble. So in order to protect the economy, in order to protect the community, the sages determined that if someone buys something at the marketplace and it's reasonable to expect that the item is a legitimate sale and not a stolen item, then the community would take on a acceptance of the risk of losing the item. So the sages said if someone buys it at the marketplace, they can hold on to it. And the only way that the owner can demand his item from the third party buyer is if the third party buyer is reimbursed either what he paid for it or what the market value of the item is. He has to be reimbursed for it. Then he has to hand the item back. So if the person who purchased the garden gnome at the market is reimbursed, whatever the reimbursement is considered to be, is reimbursed for his trouble of losing the garden gnome, then the owner can demand it back. Otherwise, the sages, according to this decree, the sages said that he cannot demand it back. There was another enactment. So this is another enactment that occurred from the time of the early sages, that one must return the stolen object to the owner even after he despairs and the item changes jurisdiction, as the details are explained in Shulchan Aruch Kosher Mishpat, chapter 361. So we have two different edicts, and both of these are from the rabbis, and they're not from the written Torah on this subject. The rabbis created edicts to allow for things to work more smoothly. These laws were not included here. So the divine code did not go into these other details. Since, as will be explained in topic 31, so that's in a later part of this chapter, every country and court has the ability to construct its own legal enactments for the better functioning of the community. So here's a precept that's being offered. This is a precept that is related to the laws of Dinam that will be in a future edition of the Divine Code. And in that, these kind of rulings that apply to the market, making sure that markets operate properly, that's under the jurisdiction of the Dinam, of the courts, of that law, of the land, to decide how it's going to function. Therefore, most likely, these edicts of the sages will be, it would be strongly advised to follow them, but that must be determined by the local courts. It's not something that's going to be mandated as such, but it's still a good idea to follow it. So we might read in a rabbinic text, there's a monetary halakha and business halakha, those kind of texts. We might read things that have to be interpreted by the local government as to how exactly they're to be handled in these cases. And this is an example of how a local government would have to decide one way or another how to handle it. So the bottom line is that if the owner of the item can demand his item back, and that can make it very difficult on the third party purchaser, especially if he wasn't aware that it was a stolen item. Also see Rambam Laws of Robbery, Chapter 2, Laws of Theft, Chapter 5, and Shulchan Aruch Kosher Mishpat, Chapters 353 and 356. C. If the owner does not despair of regaining his item at the time of the sale, and did so only afterwards. Okay, so the theft occurs, the owner's expecting it back. The thief sells it to a third party, and the owner is still expecting it back at the time of theft. However, time goes by and the owner eventually gives up hope of seeing his item back. So what happens in that case? So the person at the time of the purchase, the third party purchasing the item, the owner was still expecting it back, but now he doesn't expect it back. There is an argument between the Torah law authorities as to whether the buyer acquires it with his despair and the change of jurisdiction. There are some opinions. And so, yeah, that was the Rambam Laws of Robbery, Chapter 2, Laws of Theft, Chapter 5, and Shulchan Aruch Kosher Mishpat, Chapter 353 and 356. That applies to this point. That the buyer acquires the item and it need not be returned intact, and the thief only needs to reimburse the owner for its value. So according to the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, in that case, the thief needs to reimburse the owner, but the third party would not need to return the item. According to other opinions, and that's Rosh, Tor, and Rema, and Kosher Mishpat 353 and 356. That's the same. They're arguing concerning the Shulchan Aruch in this regard. The buyer does not acquire the item even if the owner despaired after the sale, and it must be returned intact. So these other opinions would argue that because the owner expected the item back at the time of sale, the sale was invalid, even if the owner later gave up hope of finding it. So because the sale is invalid, it would mean that the original owner still retains ownership over it. The change of jurisdiction completes acquisition. So depending on whether or not we consider the sale to the third party to be a change of jurisdiction, a legitimate change of jurisdiction, or an illegitimate one, is what's being argued here. Even if the buyer knows the item he bought was stolen. So even if he's buying it in an alley, where he knows it's fairly certain that, I mean, any sensible person would know it's stolen. Or even if the thief tells him it's stolen. I got this nice watch. I stole it from this guy. And in that case, if the circumstances are such that it's considered a valid sale, even if the person knows it's stolen, it would have gone into his jurisdiction, and therefore it's considered in his possession, not the original owner's possession. Although the buyer is forbidden to make this purchase, and since he will become an accomplice of thief, as was explained in as explained in chapter 3, that will be in the next chapter in several days. Nevertheless, this change of jurisdiction accomplishes the acquisition, and the item need not be returned intact to the original owner. Sefer Mirat Eliam, Kosher Mishpat 361:5. So if the original owner, if however we're defining it, and we saw there are different ideas, there are different definitions of how it's defined, but if it's defined as a legitimate sale, even if the buyer is aware, and if the buyer is aware, he becomes an accomplice to the theft. Or if the buyer is not aware, he's an innocent victim of the person's selling stolen property. If it's a legitimate sale, then it changes over. And we might think of it as, this is similar to the question of a person who knows it's theft, but afterwards he does own it. That would be similar to grafting a fruit tree. A person's forbidden to graft a fruit tree. But once he's grafted the fruit tree, he's allowed to eat the fruit, which might seem a little odd, but that's how it's considered. It's seen as separate actions. Similar to that, if the person buying the stolen item, he knows it's stolen, but he's buying it. He's buying it from the thief, and he knows it's stolen, and therefore he's an accomplice to the theft. But once he buys it, he does actually own it legitimately. That's because the two actions are seen as separate. This is all said in reference to the basic law. But if the buyer wishes to make complete amends, because it is a righteous character trait not to benefit from stolen property, such as if he knew that the item was stolen, and he therefore had sinned in buying it, or even if he did not know at all it was stolen, and he bought the item innocently, but afterwards he found out it was stolen, he should return the item intact to the owner and not benefit from the stolen item. And that's Darki Moshe and Sefer Mirat Eliam Kosher Mishpat 363:8. So even if the buyer does gain ownership over it, it's a righteous trait. It's a proper character trait to return the item and not to hold on to that. I mean, how could a person have a garden gnome in front of his house, knowing that it used to belong to the other guy? It would be proper. It would be a pious thing for him to do, to return the garden gnome to the original owner. But even if he's not legally required to. Thank you.